A quorum being present, the Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's hearing. I thank our panel of witnesses and our members for being here today as we talk about freedom of expression on college campuses and how post-secondary institutions are and are not respecting individuals' First Amendment rights. Here at the Education Workforce Committee, we talk a lot about the importance of all education. Education has the power to change lives, and every form of instruction that focuses on developing a student's skills is valuable, whether that skill is physical or intellectual. We focused on the skills gap, and the skills gap is a major reason we have more than 6 million open jobs in this country. But there's one skill that I believe is one of the most sought-after skills in the workplace and in the classroom, and that skill is critical thinking. All of education, but especially post-secondary institutions, have a duty to develop students' problem-solving skills. By encouraging students to engage in civil discourse and challenge their own perceptions, they sharpen their analytical skills so that they are prepared to lead the workforce once they graduate. But many institutions are taking deliberate steps to curb speech and are thus extinguishing students' critical thinking at a vital stage in their professional development. University campuses should function as a marketplace of ideas for students to exchange knowledge and share their varied and distinctive viewpoints. When freedom of thought, expression, and association are stifled on campus, the basic rights of students and staff are irreparably undermined. This is not a partisan issue. In a Gallup Night survey of students published earlier this year, every single demographic favored an open learning environment that permits what may be deemed as offensive speech by some over a campus environment that puts limits on speech deemed offensive. Furthermore, the majority of respondents reported they feel that speech is being stifled on campus. So why are some institutions placing limits on freedom of expression? There's been no shortage of news stories about some speakers being turned away from college campuses, informal censorship occurring in classrooms, and the meteoric rise of the heckler's veto. As a result, post-secondary institutions are functioning more and more like ideological echo chambers devoid of diverse thought. We've seen the creation of so-called safe spaces at some campuses where students can feel, quote, safe, end quote, from speech that upsets them. Conversely, we've seen the development of free speech zones and other schemes designed to limit free expression and shield students from ideas and concepts they may find uncomfortable or challenging. The Bill of Rights affirms certain unalienable rights, chief among them the freedom of speech. The First Amendment sets the United States apart from other nations and our incredible individual liberties are the envy of people across the world. The freedom of thought and expression are the cornerstone of our democracy, and it is crucial that we safeguard this power and privilege. In the Gallup Night poll I referenced, the majority of college students, 64%, still view their First Amendment rights as secure. However, that number has fallen by almost 10 points from 73% in the previous year's survey. As the post-secondary landscape continues to evolve, it's important that we take a close and hard look at how students' rights and freedoms are upheld on campus and at the role of the First Amendment in post-secondary education. With that, I recognize Ranking Member Scott for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I welcome our distinguished witnesses. I want to thank them for agreeing to be here and testifying on some of the most important issues surrounding the free exercise clause of the First Amendment on college campuses. For 231 years, our Constitution has made this country the envy of the world. The rights and freedoms guaranteed by our Constitution have protected us from the kinds of upheavals over religious and political issues that have led to strife and turmoil in other nations. Our country endures because of the genius of the Constitution, and while we've had many of the challenges of other nations, including a civil war, our Constitution allows us to have vigorous debates of issues followed by free and fair elections, knowing our nation will endure. We must not only celebrate the majesty of our Constitution, but protect and defend it as well. This is a shared responsibility. Unfortunately, when it comes to the issue of free speech on college campuses, far too often we see a retreat in ideological camps with selective partisan interpretations over who has free speech rights and who doesn't, who is being persecuted for their beliefs, and who are the persecutors, and where and how the lines between protected speech and unprotected speech should be drawn. These narratives are often less about enduring dialogue and proliferation of speech and more about winning the debate in a national media, but not on college campuses. America today is more politically and religiously diverse than ever before, and that extends to our nation's colleges and universities. The increased presence of students of different races, religious and socioeconomic backgrounds, gender identities, and sexual orientations on our campuses has the opportunity to grow the number of voices and the types of speech that are valued on our campuses. But with this growth has come the rise of partisan defense of First Amendment rights. While this is not always the case, many students will only hear an invocation of First Amendment rights on campus when they're being asked to tolerate speech and ideas that are intolerant to them. To be sure, while infringements on campus free speech are not just likely to come from the political right or the political left, the far right has turned the shared goal of protecting free speech into a partisan fight. Just this summer, Attorney General Jeff Sessions gave a speech decrying, quote, a generation of sanctimonious, sensitive, and supercilious snowflakes, describing the state of free speech on college campuses. Ironically, Mr. Sessions delivered that speech at an event sponsored by a conservative group that publishes professor watch lists designed to intimidate faculty and suppress academic speech. This makes it hard to consider the enforcement of free speech rights by this administration to be nonpartisan. But let's be clear, even speech that may be considered despicable speech is indeed protected by the First Amendment on public university campuses. You do not need a First Amendment to protect agreeable and acceptable speech. Public universities, as state actors, have a duty to ensure free speech, and any restriction on it must be in line with established constitutional principles. But our schools also have a duty under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in, quote, any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And we must consider what has recently accompanied this partisan fight around free speech, a documented rise of incidents of harassment towards marginalized student groups. These students rightfully fear about their safety and security, petition their administrators for help, and the First Amendment is not an excuse for inaction. In sub-regulatory guidance, the Department of Education has illustrated how a university can live up to both its requirements under the First Amendment and under Title VI by saying, and I quote, "The Office of Civil Rights has consistently reaffirmed that federal civil rights laws it enforces protect students from prohibited discrimination and are not intended to restrict expressive activities or speech protected under the Constitution's First Amendment. The fact that discriminatory harassment involves speech, however, does not relieve the school of its obligation to respond if the speech contributes to a hostile environment. Schools can protect students from such harassment without running afoul of the students' and staff's First Amendment right. Educational institutions can establish a campus culture that is welcoming and respectful of diverse linguistic, cultural, racial, and ethnic backgrounds for all students, and institute campus climate checks to assess the effectiveness of the school's efforts to ensure that it is free from harassment." This is troubling. It is troubling that in the rise of hate speech and the embrace of partisan enforcement of free speech coinciding with a damaging shift in how the Department of Education views its role in defending civil rights. Under the present administration, we've seen active investigations of claims of free speech violations at public universities brought by conservative activists, but nothing investigating the explosion in incidences of racially motivated hate speech or actions on campus which create a racially hostile environment. Students are entitled under Title VI to attend colleges that receive federal funds without being subjected to a racially hostile environment. So, Madam Chair, I believe that not every problem has a legislative solution, but Congress can do more to help schools maintain both their First Amendment and Title VI duties. To that end, I've introduced the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act. This bill would help address this challenge by requiring programs that receive federal student assistance to designate at least one Title VI compliance coordinator to investigate Title VI discrimination complaints and uphold institutional responsibility to promote a safe and inclusive learning environment. Much like the work of our Title IX coordinators that they do currently, this bill could help schools that strive to be both a marketplace of ideas and a safe and equal space for all students. I look forward to hearing from our witness today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I thank our distinguished witnesses and will now introduce them. Mr. Zachary Wood is the author of Uncensored: My Life and Uncomfortable Conversations at the Intersection of Black and White America. Mr. Joseph Cohn is the Legislative and Policy Director for the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE. Ms. Suzanne Nozzle is the Chief Executive Officer of PEN America. Mr. Ken Paulson is the President of the First Amendment Center at the Museum and Dean of the College of Media and Entertainment at Middle Tennessee State University. I now ask our witnesses to raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Let the record reflect our witnesses answered in the affirmative. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, let me briefly remind you of our lighting system. We allow 5 minutes for a witness to present testimony. When you begin, the light in front of you will turn green. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow. At the 5-minute mark, the light will turn red. At that point, I ask that you wrap up your testimony. Members will each have 5 minutes to ask questions of the witnesses. Mr. Wood, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the committee, I am honored to have the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Zach Wood. I am an editor at The Guardian and a recent graduate of Williams College, where I served for 3 years as president of Uncomfortable Learning. I identify as a liberal Democrat who supports many progressive causes. I believe a college education should challenge students to grapple with unsettling ideas. I believe America's colleges should foster critical thinking, exemplify the pursuit of knowledge, and help prepare students to contribute meaningfully to society. I believe a college campus should be conducive to challenging conversations about pressing issues of our time. When I arrived at Williams College, I was eager to explore the world of ideas. I wanted to gain a deeper understanding of humanity and the many challenges facing our world. I wanted to learn more about disagreeable perspectives. I wanted to push my intellectual limits and use my education to become a better listener, a better thinker, and a better citizen. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before I realized that many of my peers and professors dismissed ideas that challenged their worldview, particularly on issues of race, class, and gender. Deeply disappointed by this, I joined Uncomfortable Learning with the aim of stimulating thoughtful discussion and energetic debate of complicated issues. As president of Uncomfortable Learning at Williams, I advocated for the value of engaging with contentious topics and defensive views on college campuses. To promote this kind of dialogue, I invited speakers with conservative, provocative, and unpleasant ideas. This work was not easy, but I cared deeply about my education, and I felt determined to do everything in my power to improve the quality of intellectual discourse at Williams. Surely enough, my efforts were met with vehement resistance. Minutes after announcing speakers on Facebook, I received incendiary attacks from my peers. I've been called a sexist pig, a men's rights activist, a sellout, and a traitor to my race. Some even went so far as to make implicit threats, posting on Facebook that they needed the oil and the switch to deal with me in this midnight hour. In one extreme case, I received a handwritten note slid under my door that read, "Your blood will be on the leaves." I was troubled by the personal attacks. I believe my peers should have been more civil in expressing their disagreement, but I am most critical of my college administration, particularly my former college president, Adam Falk. During my sophomore year, President Falk unilaterally banned from Williams a speaker I invited because of his inflammatory remarks about race. I defended my position that on a college campus, students should be free to interrogate difficult ideas precisely because doing so can be a valuable learning experience. Frustrated, a Williams administrator in the Office of Student Life told me, "Zach, Adam Falk is the president of this college. He is the boss, and I've spoken with him. You best be careful what you write about how you disagree with him. Is that clear to you?" Shortly after, I saw President Falk at a basketball game. I walked up, extended my hand, and said, "Hello, President Falk." He made fleeting eye contact, put his head down, and swiftly walked away. I thought we could shake hands, agree to disagree respectfully. Clearly, I was wrong. Make no mistake, I understand that President Falk had a demanding job with many responsibilities, some of which I'm sure can only be appreciated by those who've been in his position. I deeply disagree with Dr. Falk's disinvitation and his response to campus controversy. I believe he misrepresented events he never attended, events that I organized and oversaw when he wrote in the Washington Post last November that today's Williams students listen closely to opposing views. I believe that in characterizing Williams as a beacon of free speech, Dr. Falk chose to ignore ad hominem attacks I and other students faced. I believe that in describing student life, he disregarded the experience of conservative students at Williams who avoid speaking in class in fear of being vilified by their professors. I part company with Dr. Falk on these matters, but I understand his prerogative as president of a private college to ban speech he finds harmful. What I object to unequivocally is the idea that any college administrator should try to intimidate a student for confronting opposing views in search of honest debate. My experience with President Falk and my administration attests to the state of free speech in higher education. We cannot improve it if we do not acknowledge that some educators and administrators can do better by their students. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wood, Mr. Cohn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Joe Cohn, and I'm the Legislative and Policy Director for FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. FIRE is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to defending the rights of students and faculty on America's college campuses. One of the core constitutional rights that FIRE defends is free speech. Thank you for holding today's hearing and for giving me an opportunity to address this critical issue. It has been literally decades since there's been any question as to whether students at public institutions of higher education enjoy fully vested First Amendment rights on public colleges and university campuses. But despite consistently strong rulings from federal courts, including the Supreme Court of the United States, censorship of many kinds persists on American college campuses today. Student and faculty's invited guests are too often disinvited from speaking or subject to efforts to intentionally shut down their events if their views are deemed offensive. Although such problems are persistent on college campuses, this testimony will focus largely on the written policies or speech codes that campus administrators use to silence expression. I hope that by focusing primarily on the written policies that institutions use to stifle speech, I can provide some insight as to how Congress can best help promote free expression. FIRE defines a speech code as any university regulation or policy prohibiting expression that would be protected by the First Amendment in society at large. Any policy, such as a harassment policy, a protest or demonstration policy, or a computer's acceptable use policy, is a speech code if it prohibits students and faculty from expressing protected speech. FIRE reviews written policies at colleges and universities nationwide and assigns speech codes red light, yellow light, or green light ratings based on the extent to which the speech code restricts student expression. A red light policy is one that both clearly and substantially restricts freedom of speech. A yellow light policy is a policy that could be interpreted to suppress protected speech, or policies, while clearly respected freedom of speech, restrict only relatively narrow categories of speech. And finally, a green light rating is one that does not seriously threaten campus expression. FIRE assigns a school their color based on the lowest rated policy they maintain, meaning that if they have 3 green light policies, 2 yellow light policies, and a red light policy, they will get a red light for their rating. The rating only covers institutions' written policies. They don't cover how policies are enforced or whether they're ignored. Last year, FIRE surveyed 461 colleges and universities, both public and private, for our Spotlight on Speech Codes 2018 report. We found that nearly 1/3, 32.3%, received a red light rating. Of the 357 public institutions we rated, 26% received a red light rating, and 65.3% received a yellow light rating. Taken together, 91% of public institutions, which are bound by the First Amendment, maintain policies that restrict constitutionally protected speech. 91%. The 2 most common forms of speech codes are policies restricting how students may express themselves in open outdoor areas of campus and overbroad anti-harassment policies. Too many institutions maintain misleadingly labeled free speech zones that limit where students can engage in expression in outdoor areas of campus. Free speech zones have been used to limit expressive rights of students on all parts of the political spectrum. We've seen them used against students who wanted to distribute literature promoting animal rights and vegan rights. We've seen them used against students who wanted to display signs promoting gun rights. And we've seen them used against students who wanted to criticize capitalism. Quarantining students' expressive rights to tiny free speech zones is both wrong and unconstitutional. The other form of speech code that I hope to address before the end of the hearing are anti-harassment policies that are written overly broad. Federal anti-discrimination law requires colleges and universities receiving federal funding, virtually all institutions, both public and private, to prohibit discriminatory harassment on campus, and simultaneously, as the ranking member has noted, they must also honor the First Amendment, and these rights do not have to be in tension. Unfortunately, too often the written policies do place these rights in tension. And that's something I hope we get a chance to address today. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Cohn. Ms. Nozzle, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify today on First Amendment rights on college campuses. We at Penn America work extensively on issues related to campus speech and have long expressed concern with growing attacks on inclusiveness, diversity, and tolerance in higher education, alongside significant infringements on free speech and the First Amendment. Our work has included a landmark 2016 report, a 2017 white paper, and 4 recent summits on campuses: the University of California at Berkeley, Middlebury College, the University of Maryland at College Park, and the University of Virginia at Charlottesville, that were each the sites of high-profile controversies over free speech issues. These summits included in-depth discussions with diverse stakeholders, including college presidents and provosts, student leaders, leading faculty, and First Amendment experts. Our foremost concern in the current climate of higher education is a lack of appreciation, understanding, and respect for free speech and open expression on campus. Faculty members challenged in the teaching of controversial subject matter, administrators facing almost daily calls to purify campuses of offensive ideas, and students with little awareness of the First Amendment, sometimes believing that the best answer to noxious ideas is to drive them into silence, even sometimes through violent protest. Some faculty have been targeted by death threats and online harassment for things they have said and have received insufficient protection and support from their institutions defending their right to free expression. But many of the most serious threats to free speech on campus fall into a gray area, not implicating the First Amendment directly because they do not involve official actions by administrators or because they've arisen at private rather than public institutions. Oftentimes, protected speech is pitted against other speech, with one person's publication or comment in class unleashing a torrent of response that, while perfectly permissible, can nonetheless feel intimidating, censorious, or even punitive. Legitimate, unquestionably lawful rights to protest and offer counter-speech can be wielded in ways that prompt self-censorship and silence. The ferocity of social media reaction to even a single badly worded or provocative tweet or post can be enough to deter all but the most courageous from entering into debate on certain hot-button topics. These tensions are constricting our discourse and may prevent worthy opinions and proposals from even being heard. Yet, these dilemmas do not submit to ready legal or regulatory solution, and to attempt one risks suppressing as much, if not more, speech than is protected. We're fortunate that the breadth and vision of our First Amendment offers an enduring lodestar to help guide the way through these controversies. Attempts to further elaborate rights and responsibilities when it comes to permitting or constricting speech should be undertaken with caution. Any effort to untangle the roots of our free speech controversies must be predicated on a full appreciation of what it means for a campus to be truly open to all ideas and perspectives. An open campus must uphold the rights of all students to participate freely and equally. Higher education is in the midst of a dramatic demographic shift, with institutions enrolling vastly more students of color than ever before, as well as students from immigrant backgrounds and diverse religious traditions. This rising generation arrives at the Quad with new expectations about respect for individual differences, equality, and having their voices heard. Many of these students and their allies have valid concerns about the imperative to eradicate persistent manifestations of discrimination that have outlasted efforts at integration, such as slurs, stereotypes, informal segregation, and racist incidents. Sometimes calls to curtail or punish speech are born of a frustration that campuses have not done enough to address these persistent concerns. While such efforts to suppress speech are misguided, they cannot be effectively addressed without getting to the root of the problem and looking at the underlying concerns of equality and inclusion that motivate them. In Penn America, we believe the solution lies in focusing on education and awareness of the First Amendment, engaging with a diversity of campus stakeholders to demonstrate commitment to open debate, and fostering constructive dialogue across difference that upholds the free speech rights of all. It's critical that universities avoid instituting punitive measures targeting protest or dissent that will chill free speech in the name of protecting it. While questions of speech implicate power and politics, it is also essential that free speech on campus not become a politicized or partisan issue. The First Amendment leans neither left nor right, but recent interventions by the Department of Justice risk creating a different impression. The DOJ has rightly raised some important concerns about overreach and the administrative policing of free expression on certain campuses, prompting universities to reconsider restrictive policies. However, by accompanying these interventions with rhetoric castigating progressive students as snowflakes, vilifying campus administrators, and wrongly suggesting that attacks on free speech target only the right, the genuine constitutional concerns at stake that ought to be at the heart of these efforts become clouded over by ideology and divisive rhetoric. If the DOJ compounds these perceptions, they will surrender the chance to persuade skeptical students that the First Amendment is a critical tool in their quest for social justice and one that they should embrace and defend. Thank you to the committee, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Paulson, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm Ken Paulson. I'm the Dean of the College of Media and Entertainment at Middle Tennessee State University, the President of the First Amendment Center at the Newseum Institute, and the former Editor-in-Chief of USA Today, where I remain a columnist writing about free speech and media issues. My move into academia was actually a late career decision. My years in American journalism were gratifying, and this felt like the opportunity to give back. Being on a campus over the past 5 years has been both rewarding and eye-opening. I have to admit, I initially looked at our students as a generation similar to my own. Externally, we certainly were. Dirty blue jeans worn daily, a struggle to stay alert during early morning classes, and every possible combination of hairstyle and facial hair. But I quickly discovered this is an entirely new generation. They're the Google generation, young people for whom answers have always been milliseconds away. They're amazing multitaskers, but there's a drawback to the Google it culture. If you can always access information, you don't have to memorize it or even think deeply about it. That's particularly the case with America's most fundamental freedoms. To be clear, I deeply admire the work of watchdog organizations like the Foundation of Individual Rights in Education, who through a combination of watchfulness, litigation, and publicity shine a light on college campuses where administrators and sometimes students pay lip service to freedom of speech. The work they do is invaluable. But I also must tell you that when I see widely distributed news stories about students shouting down speakers or college administrators engaging in heavy-handed tactics, I don't see my own campus. 70% of the students at Middle Tennessee State University are the first in their families to attend college. Their concerns are paying for school, staying in school, and making good enough grades to get a job when they leave. That's a dynamic you will find at universities all over America. As part of my First Amendment work, I travel on average to maybe a dozen campuses a year for the past 20 years, and I honestly don't believe that there's an epidemic of suppression or intolerance in the nation's universities. I do see some high-profile instances where college administrators and students are willing to bend free speech principles to prevent hurt feelings or ideological conflict. Somewhere over the past 2 decades, the land of the free has become the home of the easily offended. There are some who see free speech limitations and ask for Congress to do something. But with all due respect, this is not about legislation. This is about education. You can't shout down a speaker if you truly understand how diversity of opinions have bolstered our democracy. You can't censor students or their media if you understand what Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the first generation of Americans meant by freedom of the press. You can't try to zone protests off campus if you truly appreciate the value of petition and assembly. But too many of our students, and sadly their parents and grandparents, don't truly understand these core American principles. First Amendment Center surveys show that a full third of Americans cannot name a single freedom in the First Amendment, and only 2% can name all 5. I won't put you on the spot this morning. In 2007, as editor of USA Today, I convened a group of educators, First Amendment experts, librarians, artists, and journalists to found One for All, a name derived from the First Amendment's role in enriching the lives of all Americans. Amendment 1 for all. It's a national educational effort with the most basic mission: to build understanding and support for freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. And at a time of deep political polarization, we choose not to take sides. In fact, we believe that a shared commitment to freedom of speech, press, faith, all our core liberties should actually serve to unify this nation. We build awareness through campus events, social media outreach, educational materials, and scholarship competitions like Free to Tweet, in which students across the country tweeted about the importance of the First Amendment. When I teach constitutional law to students, I always explain that the Constitution supplanting the Articles of Confederation is actually the rebooting of America, a similar operating system with major upgrades, including a Bill of Rights. But our nation now needs to dig out that manual. Having the right to say whatever we want does us no good if no one is willing to listen. The most American of values are in the First Amendment. It's not a coincidence that the most vibrant, ambitious, strongest, most dynamic country in the history of the planet is also the most free. All of us who influence students' lives from kindergarten through college have two overriding obligations. If we do our jobs the right way, our students will go on to rewarding careers and lives. But even more important than turning out great professionals is our obligation to graduate great citizens who understand what this nation is all about. America is depending upon us. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your very, very thoughtful testimony. I have some questions, but I want to make one quick comment. I taught for 15 years at Appalachian State University, and I have to tell you, the greatest compliment I received every semester when I did my evaluations were when students would say, "She taught us how to think." I always felt that was the greatest compliment. Mr. Wood, lifelong learning requires the ability to grapple with concepts and ideas that may make you feel uncomfortable. What do you want your peers who shy away from tough conversations to realize about your experience at Williams College?
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. It's my hope that my peers would recognize that if they want to go out into the world and make a difference and be contributing members of society, it will be very important for them to learn how to articulate differences of opinion, very important for them to learn how to advocate for what they believe in, and very important for them to see the humanity in those that they disagree with and to believe in the possibility of finding common ground even when it's difficult. So I hope that from the work that I did on campus, they'll see that while that work is very challenging, it is worthwhile.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cohn, you noted a comment I made in a hearing last year about my concern about people willing to sacrifice their rights because they may disagree with what is being said. I'm still surprised by that. Your organization does a particularly good job of putting pressure on institutions of post-secondary education to uphold the First Amendment rights of its student body. What advice do you have to students who want to change their school's restrictive policies? What are the most effective ways they can push back against college administrators or other students who are trying to thwart their rights?
Thank you, Chairwoman. The primary advice that I would give any student who wants to improve the state of free speech on their campus is to stand up for themselves when they have something they want to say, but to also stand up for others who they disagree with. It is not a team sport, free speech, where you have to divide lines. If you aren't principled about your approach, then you don't really believe in free speech. So be vigilant no matter who the speaker is. I would also say be reasonable in your tone when addressing campus administrators. Don't view them as the enemy or an adversary. Work with them. Try to bring them in on a shared mission of promoting free speech. Make the compelling case. And also don't be afraid to call fire or anyone else for help.
Thank you. Mr. Paulson, thank you for the work you're doing to help Americans understand the core principles that make our country so unique. I'm interested in your One for All educational effort, particularly interested in how your work has changed or evolved with the rise of social media. When you started the One for All campaign, social media platforms were in their infancy. How has social media changed the way Americans perceive their First Amendment rights?
It certainly, thank you, Chairwoman, it certainly amplified their free speech rights. I'm confident that Thomas Jefferson would be an endless tweeter, and that really what we see today in social media is the culmination of First Amendment principles. Everyone has a voice. Everyone can be heard. The challenge for young people, though, is that it almost makes them fearful to speak freely sometimes, because if they put an idea out there, they can be slammed aggressively by their peers, and that's a challenge. The good news from our research is that young people who do engage in social media, especially news and social media, tend to have a higher respect for the First Amendment and have a better understanding of the principles. So as chaotic as social media can be, we believe there's a silver lining for free speech.
Thank you, and I want to thank you especially for pointing out that there are 5 parts to the First Amendment, and I think you're right. Most people do not remember that. Mr. Scott, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cohn, in your red, yellow, and green, did you differentiate between content-based restrictions on speech and time, place, and manner restrictions?
Well, not all time, place, and manner restrictions are constitutional because time, place, and manner restrictions have to be narrowly tailored in furtherance of a significant interest. They have to be content and viewpoint neutral. A lot of the time, place, and manner restrictions on college campuses fail that test, so plenty of them earn yellow and red lights still.
Mr. Paulson, you talked about people who are easily offended. How do you avoid a hostile racial environment that encourages people to just leave campus and free speech?
Well, of course, we have to first define, are we talking about a public or private university? And so doing the First Amendment work I do, my focus would be on a public university. Every public institution, especially those that involves an application process, you have a right to establish codes of conduct and standards and principles. There is nothing at a public university that would prevent somebody from saying something racially insensitive and offending someone, just as that same circumstance could occur on Main Street of any city in this country. There's nothing a university administration can do. But I think it's important for our universities to proactively generate understanding of the First Amendment and all the core principles, and to again say, you know, you're going to hear some things on this campus that trouble you deeply. And what that means is you have an obligation as a citizen to speak out against injustice and insensitivity and racism and sexism. The same tool every citizen has, free speech, is used to offend. It can also be used to defend.
Ms. Nelson, what can a college do when you have racially insensitive things going on in order to avoid a Title VI violation?
They can investigate, they can make sure there are readily accessible systems for registering complaints. They can ensure that all those who have information to offer provide that information. They can formulate an appropriate response consistent with law on harassment, disciplinary response for those involved. They can educate the campus about what happened, foster open dialogue, pursue reconciliation approaches in some cases that are centered on engagement and exchange between those who may not understand each other, may not sometimes recognize how offensive their content may be, how it may be received by others. So there's a great deal that can and should be done. If it ventures into hate crimes, there are mechanisms for prosecution of those crimes that are underutilized. So there's an enormous amount that can be done and that needs to be pursued, and that I think is an important counterpoint for measures to robustly defend freedom of speech on campus.
Well, if you allow an atmosphere to occur, at some point people are going to just up and leave. How do you avoid essentially segregating a college by unlimited and unresponded to free speech?
I think many universities have done a good job trying to create an environment that is welcoming and inclusive to all, trying to recognize the breadth of experiences that students bring, ensure that they have places where they can associate freely, assemble around common interests, and that they feel at home and included, able to speak out, and that's essential for freedom of expression to thrive as well. If students feel silenced or marginalized, you don't have an open marketplace for ideas. So there's an enormous amount proactively that the university can do, and many positive examples of best practices to foster that kind of environment.
You said can do under Title VI. What do they have to do?
They have to create an equal learning environment for all students, and that requires not simply an admissions policy that brings in students from diverse backgrounds, but also examining every facet of campus life, whether it's residential life, what happens in the classroom, what the disciplinary procedures are, All of that is part of ensuring an inclusive and equal educational environment, which is their obligation.
And is there a difference in obligation, public and private versus private?
Not in terms of equal education, I don't believe.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letter from the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities on their position on free speech and their position of S2394.
Without objection. Gentlemen, yield back.
You're back, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Wahlberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for holding this this hearing. It's time, and thank you to the panel that's here today. I appreciate your willingness to be here, your expertise, and Mr. Wood, I appreciate your tenacity, regardless of your political philosophy, in standing up for clear principles of freedom.
Thank you, sir.
First Amendment. I have the privilege of representing a number of colleges and universities in my district. While Hillsdale College, I certainly experienced the opportunity to speak on that campus. But I don't assume that for any of the other campuses, and don't assume that I'll be giving many commencement addresses on those campuses for various reasons, because of my faith as well as my political policy. I get that, and they can make those choices. I don't expect, as I've had in the past, having to be disinvited from giving a commencement speech, which I've experienced as well. I don't expect to get honorary doctorates from some of those campuses, though it's interesting that 2 honorary doctorates that I've received came from universities in former Iron Curtain countries. And so it's evident that there is an issue there we have to deal with. I think it is a great concern that we've seen our country moving the direction where we will decide that free speech, freedom of association, and the rest of the 5 are not something that are preeminent in our country, and we must fight that. So, Mr. Wood, let me ask you, understanding that finding others with common interests and identities is important to student well-being, what specific barriers have you seen for students being able to associate, and that's one of those maybe forgotten 5 parts of our First Amendment liberties. What specific barriers do you see to having freedom of association around shared beliefs and ideas on our university campuses today?
Thank you. I would say that one thing I've noticed is that it is generally discouraged when students, depending upon how they identify on campus, depending upon what their political views are, if they are seen as being around people who are like-minded more often than putting themselves in more diverse spaces, there are ways in which that can be viewed negatively. One thing that has tended to help, in my experience, is when the administration changes their messaging. So at Williams, it was a small college, 2,300 students. So everything that the administration said resonated in a way that it might not at a larger university. And so one thing I noticed was that when the administration framed things differently, that was then able to reach the student body.
So frame things differently about specifics in the association?
Well, the importance of the First Amendment, why it is to everyone's benefit, why it can entail difficulties, right? So I think that one thing that my administration didn't do such a great job in the beginning of my time at Williams was in explaining the value of free speech, explaining the importance of free association in a way that's intelligible for college students.
And that then encouraged students to see the fact that if you had a Christian campus organization, that it was okay for them to have all students come there, but to have leadership that had to be in sync with the principles of their faith.
I think it helped increase their understanding. That's not to say that a significant number of people were more on board afterwards, but I do think it helped to increase understanding.
Mr. Paulson, let me ask you the same question going around all of the universities, colleges that you've gone to, primarily public, as you said. What have you seen there that are discouragements to having freedom of association on campus?
Well, as a great question. As you know from my own remarks now, I don't see a widespread limit on freedom of association. My great concern is there doesn't seem to be an awareness that a free speech zone actually goes from coast to coast, and that there is an effort by universities to establish specific geographic locations where students can gather to meet, to protest, to speak out, and the notion that that can be done in a 20-square-foot area, when in fact the entire United States of America is a free speech zone, is to me very disturbing.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much to the chair and ranking member, but really to all of the witnesses. It's pretty clear that you have a lot more in common than different in this really interesting hearing we're having this morning. I think back about the First Amendment over the years and what a powerful tool it has been. Think about the civil rights movement and how that attracted the attention of students on college campuses across the South, and they participated in sit-ins and boycotts and marches and the Freedom Ride, and led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And I would hope that today's students should feel as empowered to use their First Amendment rights to further progress toward equality and justice. And colleges and universities are certainly places where students should learn how to exchange ideas and beliefs. But they should also be places of that value inclusion and diversity and tolerance. And I know students from all backgrounds should be able to express their views and have them debated respectfully. College campuses today, as Mr. Paulson noted, they're certainly more diverse. They're racially, ethnically, religiously diverse, and a student body that is that diverse can really bring about valid concerns. According to the Anti-Defamation League, there were 346 instances of white supremacist activity on 216 college campuses just between September of 2016 and January of 2018, which is unacceptable. Think about Heather Heyer, who was killed in a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Richard Collins III, a black student at the University of Maryland, who was just last year at a campus bus stop and murdered because of his race. And that's a sort of chilling reminder that bias and hate still exist in our country, but I think it also helps to explain this tension that we've been talking about this morning between free speech and a safe and inclusive campus. And I agree with Ranking Member Scott that unfortunately the Trump administration has turned free speech on college campuses into a partisan issue, and it should not be, undermining real concerns about inequality. Research shows that most students on college campuses are not out to silence students with whom they disagree. At Georgetown University study found little evidence that conservatives are unfairly targeted. The study also shows that infringements on campus free speech are just as likely to come from the right as the left. It should not be a partisan issue. This is about free speech. The Trump administration should be focused on promoting constructive dialogue and supporting safe, equal, and inclusive college campuses, and finding that, addressing that tension and protecting civil rights of all students and investigating those civil rights complaints. And thank you, Ms. Nozzle, for talking about that. So, Ms. Nozzle, this issue presents an opportunity to discuss how we can build a society and culture where we do learn to listen with each other, to each other, and benefit from each other's views and experiences. I happen to have a journalism degree and a law degree, so I wish we had 20 minutes each, Madam Chair. I've been a longtime proponent of civics education. So how can we better educate students about the First Amendment? And college is obviously too late. When should we start? Ms. Nozzle.
You know, I think we should start in the beginning of elementary school, and I think this has been, unfortunately, a kind of withered aspect of our educational system, and that we're suffering from the consequences, and others have cited the statistics in terms of the gaps in knowledge that people are bringing into college. I don't think it's too late in college, because I think that is, often the first time that people encounter others from very different backgrounds, and that's the first time these clashes of views may be experienced by them. And so I think it's a very important opportunity to hopefully reinforce learning that's happened earlier on, but also to push further
we absolutely need to start sooner. I agree. Ms. Nozzle, we're talking about how the federal government can support universities in really creating the diverse and inclusive and safe communities without compromising free speech. How do we address that tension? Can you discuss the sort of rise in instances in bias and discrimination and how we can address the tensions that are affecting students? Because it's important to address that.
Absolutely. I think making sure that the mechanisms to address those incidents are readily available and present, that administrators are educated about how to respond. Many of them are caught flat-footed when these incidents happen, and that can provoke student anger and sort of fuel these calls to curtail speech. Whereas when administrations are proactive, they're affirmative, they're seen as being responsive, engaged with the student body, taking matters seriously, working diligently to address and foster a more equal and inclusive climate, particularly in response to those incidents, then I don't think we see these kinds of flare-ups erupt.
Thank you. And I'm going to get a quick question. And Mr. Wood, thank you for your testimony. Have you read Rising Out of Hatred? Rising Out of Hatred is a story about Derek Black, who is have you read the books?
Yes.
White supremacist
Yes.
who went to a college. And when his college classmates found out who he was, many of them protested, wanted him kicked out of campus, but a group of students stepped up, invited him to dinner, got to know him, and over time he changed his views and renounced white supremacy. Can you comment on how we can get more students to be like those who embraced him and wanted to know him rather than rejected him?
I think one important thing that can be done is that educators can set the example. So one thing I noticed is that there were some professors I had who would make a point of encouraging us to consider multiple perspectives in class, and who would explain at the beginning of the semester the value of doing that. There were other professors, though, whom I had who would simply, whatever they stated, they would present as fact rather than as opinion. And we would only engage with one viewpoint on very controversial and complex topics, whether it was welfare or affirmative action or healthcare. I think that if educators set the example and say, we should consider these things more complexly, and here's the value of talking with people you disagree with. That's
Thank you.
one.
My time has expired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Time has expired. Mr. Guthrie, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to follow up with, Suzanne, I don't say Suzanne, Ms. Bonamici was talking about, and so it's kind of current to me. Monday, I dropped my daughter off for her beginning her junior year of college, and all the freshmen were showing up, and they're on the quarter system, so they're late, so whatever. But it just seemed like such a, the grass was manicured, everything was ready for people to start their first day of school, and so it's all exciting. And so the thing that I want my daughter to have a great experience in school and believe me, I just don't want her to have one opinion. I want her to form her own, and she's the type person that does. And so it's all been said, the last couple of years we've been real satisfied. But the one thing that when you see a lot of the protests and stuff that go on campus is not necessarily hers as we've seen. And I do think they have a very good administration. But how do you balance protecting the First Amendment, kind of open to the panel, First Amendment and campus safety? I mean, where it gets to the point where it's not safe, and should cost be a factor in this calculation? I don't know who wants to begin with it. Ms. Nelson, I see you shaking your head, or?
I can say a little bit. I mean, I think, that's an issue that has really reared its head, particularly over the last year and a half, with very significant costs attached to certain high-profile speakers who come on campus, violent incidents, and the university having to take responsibility in this debate over whether the organizers of these speeches should bear those costs. The position that we've taken is that for the time being, it is better for a public university to bear the cost of security to enable the speech to go forward, and that the value of keeping the campus open in the long run and providing for a speaker to come in a way that's going to allow for counter-protests, that's going to allow everybody to be heard, that's going to ensure and guarantee safety and prevent violent outbreaks is more important. And over time, if we can normalize that kind of approach to these speeches, those costs will come down, and the likelihood of a violent eruption will decrease. So I think it's, for right now, a kind of cost that the public has to bear in order to keep our campuses open.
Okay, I want to go ahead and ask another question unless y'all have something else. So, Mr. Khan, I want to ask you this. There have been a number of legal precedents on the establishment of free speech protections on college campuses. Most court cases appear to reprimand institutions for misconduct, but have there been rulings you believe missed the mark and still stand as precedent?
I'd like to give a little bit more thought to that question rather than answer it off the top of my head. A majority of the cases go in favor of the students. That's not uniform, but a vast majority of the times that speech codes have been challenged across the country, they've been struck down. There is a case that we're watching very closely in Georgia that's dealing with a standing question. For a long time, FIRE's been concerned that courts have not always recognized that there should be maybe damages attached with censorship. So when a student graduates, courts have found that their cases are moot, and that threatens the ability for students to have redress, especially at two-year colleges, or when they're graduate students or when they're going close to graduation. So that's one of the reasons why we're turning to Congress to try to fill that standing loophole.
Okay, thanks. And I want to ask Mr. Paulson a question. I believe it is imperative for society to have a citizenry exposed to many opinions and diverse thoughts in order to thrive. Yet it seems we have a tendency to shut ourselves off from contrary or differing viewpoints. What are the greatest barriers we face as a society to instilling a proper understanding of our First Amendment rights? And do you believe events on campus are contributing to a decline in national unity and our capacity to self-govern?
Actually, I think that campuses are a great hope. And in all candor, one of the challenges, as I listen here to the stories about people shouting down speakers and tensions because of a speaker, I'm sure I'm going to regret saying this, but I'm a little envious because the norm at 95% of America's colleges and universities is students don't show up for speakers. If I tell students about an exciting speaker, they will have two questions from me. Is this good for extra credit? And will it be on the final exam? I think universities have an obligation to give students as much exposure to a variety of ideas as possible. Make the marketplace of ideas real. And so I think universities are actually the solution. They can offer diversity of opinions that young people who don't attend college are not going to get. It's incredibly valuable, but our great challenge is intriguing them enough in the marketplace of ideas that they show up. And I think because we don't train them early on in caring about the issues, we don't do enough good work in civics or critical thinking, they tend to go home at the end of the day when they should be there engaging with speakers.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired, and I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The answer to the question is yes, if you write a one-page paper on it. Mr. Takano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to start with my question with Mr. Wood. Mr. Wood, can you share your thoughts about the importance of having a diverse faculty at a university or college, including minority faculty members with diverse backgrounds, and how that diversity has affected you as a student?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I believe that it can be of great value in institutions of higher education to have diversity in terms of viewpoints and politics, to have diversity in terms of race and gender, and I think that it's something that colleges should strive for, institutions should strive for. I think that for me personally, having more diverse faculty means that you're engaged with a greater variety of experiences, a greater variety of backgrounds, and a greater variety of perspectives. And so for me, that just helps to enrich students' understanding of the complexity of the world and the complexity of the many issues that you're there really to learn about.
So I had the honor of being a guest at Yom Kippur services, and the rabbi gave a very thought-provoking sermon. And she brought up the subject of Derek Black, and she described, and I'll quote some of it, I can't read all of it, I wish I could. She said, after high school, Derek decided to study medieval history, so he applied and was accepted to a liberal arts school with a strong program in that subject. The school also was ranked as one of the most pot-friendly, most gay-friendly in the state, and according to Derek's dad, Don. So, you know, he applied, I'm not saying that Williams is a pot-friendly school, I'm just saying that it's a very liberal campus. But at first, Derek refrained from discussing his views on campus, but he hung out with students, including an approving immigrant and an Orthodox Jew. But when he was outed by his fellow students who had been researching his association with terrorist groups, a heated online discussion ensued. How did we as a community respond? let me just kind of speed up to the end of the rabbi's sermon. She said, let me just get to the bottom of it. He says, and she said, perhaps we need to learn an important lesson about patience, because actually Derek does change. But it's the reaction of the community of that campus. Rather than shaming him, they engaged him. And her whole sermon was about the virtue of engaging people, not to give up hope that you, or to just assume that there's no ability to change another person's mind through sincere dialogue. But I want you, do you think it's important that there's a diverse student body as well? Because I think that had an impact on Derek.
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely important that you have a diverse student body for really in many of the same ways that I think it's important to have a diverse faculty. With respect to the remarks that you made, I completely agree with that. I think that patience is important. I think that talking to people we disagree with, who have different experiences, is important. And I think that a college campus should be a great place to do that.
Let me turn to Mr. McCone. Most recently, Attorney General Sessions has extolled the importance of free speech and protections. The Trump administration, though, recently adopted a new definition of anti-Semitism to investigate and enforce Title VI violations on college campuses. Many view this new definition as being intended to chill speech that's critical of the government of Israel. Mr. Cohn, is this recent action an infringement of constitutional free speech protection?
I think it is unconstitutional to use that definition when determining what student speech crosses the line from being protected into harassment. And I think it's deeply problematic that it's being used in that particular context. FIRE spoken out about that, PEN America has spoken out about that, the ACLU has spoken out about that. We're all in agreement that the definition has utility in collecting data, but does not have utility in how it's used to enforce speech.
I appreciate that consistency. I'm very troubled, especially by the dialogue that happens on campuses that's, I think, gets overheated and people don't listen to each other, especially around topics like BDS or, that people, there's just students, Jewish students feel suppressed and not able to say, and then, go ahead, Mr.
If I may add just one more thing, there is a real problem of anti-Semitism on college campuses that does need to be addressed, but there is another approach and constitutional approach to doing that. One is to make sure there's clarity from Congress on when speech crosses the line from being protected and becomes a course of conduct that is harassing. The Supreme Court has provided that test. Schools don't use it all the time. You should tell them, no, you have to use it. So that's the test in Davis versus Monroe County Board of Education. The other thing is that religion is not a protected status in higher ed or educational context, except with respect to admissions and segregation. You should fix that loophole as well. And the third thing that I would recommend to address it effectively is to codify what I think was a very smart interpretation of the anti-discrimination statutes by the Department of Education years ago that says that sometimes discrimination on someone's religion is really more about the cultural aspects that are associated with the religion more than the religious practices or beliefs themselves. Sikhs, Muslims, Jews, and other religions having all kinds of parts of their identity that are tied to the religion, and that there is jurisdiction already under the titles that deal with national origin and ethnicity when those factors are implicated. So I think that three-pronged approach is a better approach to dealing with anti-Semitism, along, of course, with education on the ground.
Mr.
Cohn,
Chicano,
thank you.
I have to stop you there.
No,
We're way over the time.
No, I appreciate you. I was going to say I appreciate it. I wasn't going to ask it.
I want to ask members to not make 2 minutes of speeches and then ask questions in your last 30 seconds. Okay? Thank you. Mr. Byrne, you're recognized.
Ooh, I better not make a 2-minute speech. So when I was in college, far from being protected from different points of view, the university administration, the faculty, wanted to expose us to different points of view. And so they made it a point of doing that. I can remember within a matter of weeks, we had both Stokely Carmichael, Black Panther, and Milton Friedman, one of the most conservative economists in the world. I remember a panel where we had some of the most liberal political commentators in the country, and also a very young George Will, who I'd never heard of before. And then they brought Hunter S. Thompson to campus. I don't know if y'all even know who Hunter S. Thompson is, but he gloried in insulting people from the podium. And it was our job as students to be able to think our way through what we were supposed to take that as and respond to it. So in my 45-second speech, what I want to do, I'm going to start with you, Mr. Wood. What's the role of the federal government to get us back to where we encourage free speech on campuses so that we grow students that have strong ability to argue intellectually against opinions that they disagree with?
I would say two things. One, there was legislation passed in several states last summer, I believe. You had some in North Carolina, you had some in Tennessee, and I believe Wisconsin. And I believe Tennessee was the most robust. I believe it would be helpful and useful to think about ways to address the heckler's veto specifically. That's something I've noticed that's an issue, and I think that's something that can be addressed federally. And so I would point to that. And then I would also say to clarify when the line is crossed, because that's something that's unclear for many people. So I think just general messaging in terms of using the platform that you all have as elected officials to say, there are things that are difficult to hear, that are challenging to hear, that people might even find offensive, but they do not cross the line, right? Which means they are not a direct imminent threat, and therefore they are protected by the First Amendment.
I'll never forget when Mr. Stokely Carmichael spoke, he said some very inappropriate things about African-American women. And some of my colleagues, some of my fellow students, African-American women, got up and challenged him. And I was so proud of them because they had really thought through how they were going to respond to that. And they used what we had been taught to use, which was their brains and their ability to articulate their position in a way that really just kind of put him in his place. And I'm worried that we're missing that, Mr. Paulson. I appreciate what Mr. Wood had to say. Do you have any other suggestions for us?
Well, you clearly had a phenomenal college education. You probably didn't need to attend classes with those speakers. That's phenomenal.
I did attend classes, Judge, just for the record.
I think there needs to be much more of that. I do think, though, there is no role for government in any form. You know, marketplace of ideas is not a cliche. It's a marketplace. And what you need to deliver to a college campus is a wide variety of speakers and let students seek them out, hear them, and respond to them as you've described. We become, I talk about the nation being easily offended. What I prefer is a nation that's easily stirred to speech that combats what they are offended by. And I think every university should think about declaring themselves a First Amendment campus and tell every student from day one, you're going to hear things you never want to hear. You're going to hear things that will challenge your beliefs. But that's part of your education here. So we will never disinvite a speaker. We will never charge any speaker exorbitant cleanup fees or security fees. We're going to make sure all these voices are coming. And if you're not comfortable with that, don't come to our university.
Real quickly, though, let me ask you this question. Obviously, these universities, private and public, are very dependent upon the money that flows to them from us through these financial aid programs. You know that.
Right.
I mean, I do think that we have some role to play if we're providing what's basically financing the university. Can't we say something, can't we have some policy that says you have to have that First Amendment policy for you to be able to receive this financial aid money?
Well, I respect your motive, but I will tell you, if you believe there's a role for you in this process, please consider starting that role at age 5, so that when they get to that campus, they will be the ones who rise up and challenge that speaker during the Q&A portion. I don't see a role for government on a public college campus, just as I don't see a role for government to moderate discussions of people at the corner bar. Once they're 18 years old, it should be a free-for-all of good ideas. Now, that doesn't mean that threats are condoned. It doesn't mean violent incitement to violence is condoned. But, you know, the bubble is broken. And by the time you're 18 years old, you better get used to other ideas. We should just make clear to the consumer, the student who's coming in, that that's the culture they'll walk into. Congress can do wonderful things, but I don't think this is one of them.
I appreciate your perspective. I will start with my 4-year-old grandson. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Shea Porter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel for coming in and sharing your ideas about this. I wish that we could have this kind of discussion in every high school for 12th grade. because I think that's when they're about to really launch and get an understanding of what we're talking about. I certainly understand, the First Amendment. I think all of us on the panel have had moments where we have felt that something that we were saying politically was not being well received by others. And I can remember during the ACA, I had just started to speak at a town hall, and they started screaming, "Shut up, we didn't come here to listen to you." And it's like, okay, so, I'll wait until we're all ready. We understand that. That's part of the political discourse. It's not great, but it happens, and that's in a different setting. But I wanted to talk about the campuses, because what I worry about there, and I remember my own University of New Hampshire many years ago having an issue with free speech with the Chicago 7, and they ultimately were able to speak there. So I have found that trying to suppress or repress speech in general does not work, and it's not in our best interest. It's better to, let the light shine on, because it is a sanitation to ugliness. However, what happens, and I want each one of you please to tell me where the line is for you, because I think this happens more than we realize, where people come and we don't agree with them, and they may be fairly hostile to democracy or to anything else that we hold dear. But when does the line cross in a speech where they are speaking to a group of people, some supportive, some not, and they stray into an area that smacks of real hatred or the things that we worry about? And what is a university to do when that happens? Is it just let it happen? And if it feels like it's inciting a small minority of the crowd, then is there any role, or just let them continue and hope that things work out? And I'm not sure myself, so I'm asking. I tend to think, let them keep going once they're there, but there must be something that there's a fallout when we hear that, when we know that a speaker has really gone right into hatred and right into tearing down, or maybe they're supporting Nazis and giving their best explanation and revealing themselves, whatever it is. Is there any line for each one of you that you think requires action, or just let it keep going?
Maybe I'll lead off. Well, that's a great question, but I think your instincts are absolutely right. Let him speak. One of the most misunderstood things about free speech in America is that somehow hate speech is different, and that we should somehow treat it as not having the same worthiness. Well, it doesn't have a lot of value, but the truth is that when we adopted the First Amendment, there was a lot of hate speech around, and you didn't need a First Amendment to protect popular and widely agreed with speech. And so at the very beginning of this nation's, the rebooting in 1791, there was a commitment that said you can say whatever you want, no matter how unpalatable. And I think, if somebody strays into an area that you didn't anticipate them speaking about, maybe we needed better vetting. But the bottom line is that speech has to go on a college campus.
Yeah. We do have a legal standard for incitement to imminent violence, so there is a threshold that you cannot cross, and that is clearly, supported by the Constitution, and where at a public university, they would be authorized and within their rights to step in. So that exists. I think short of that, there's a big difference between whether a speaker should be invited and whether they should be disinvited. I think, campus is under no obligation to invite somebody who they believe is going to spew a hateful message. I don't think they should be compelled to do so. If that invitation is issued, and many campuses, I think, rightly have a liberal policy when it comes to any department or student organization being authorized to bring a speaker to campus, I think those decisions should be made thoughtfully, but if the person is invited, I think they should be allowed to speak. You should create an opportunity for counter speech. You should ensure safety. You should be mindful of that threshold of incitement to violence. But I think disinvitations and shutting down speech do more harm than good. And I also think there's a setting to air those noxious ideas, and sometimes the academic setting is a place where they can be debated.
Thank you very much.
I'll be quick. Censorship has rarely worked, and it doesn't really work to eliminate hateful views. The value of hate speech being in the public square is that it can be refuted. It helps us diagnose the extent of the problem and how common it is. So we need to allow speech to proceed unless it actually crosses the legal threshold on incitement, which is particularly high.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'll be brief. I concur with what the other three panelists have said. For me, I draw the line when it is a direct incitement to violence. But as a student who was inviting speakers to campus, what I was really interested in was bringing speakers with ideas and thoughts that were provocative, that were socially relevant, who were interested in engaging in good faith.
Thank you. And as the great philosopher said, I abhor what you said, and I'm paraphrasing, but I defend to my death your right to say it. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Stefanik, you're recognized for 5
Thank you, Madam Chair. I ask unanimous consent to enter a statement into the record from Dr. Harry Lewis, who's a professor of computer science at Harvard, and a statement for the record from Carol Jones and Judd Horace, respectively the chairman of the National Pan-Hellenic Conference and the president of the North American Interfraternity Conference.
Without objection.
Great, I tried to go quickly. Mr. Cohen, in your written statement, you talked about Harvard's policy, which makes membership in an off-campus single-gender organization a punishable offense. And I'm a graduate of Harvard, so this is of interest to me. You talk about how, while initially the policy was targeted towards all male organizations, one of the consequences has also limited women's organizations. I'm a proud graduate of an all-girls high school and middle school. I think that experience helped prepare me and taught me leadership skills that I hope to put to use today. And I also helped start a women's leadership organization as an undergrad at Harvard. So I am very concerned about this policy's limitation when it comes to our freedom of association. And I think it's important for the viewers and the audience here today to know that these organizations that Harvard blacklists students who are a part of, they're independent, they receive no financial or administrative support from the university. My question for you is, and Mr. Byrne touched upon this a bit, how can we as Congress, should we consider extending protection to students who attend private institutions accepting federal funding? How do we draw that line, whether it's Title IV funding or federal research dollars?
Thank you for the question, Representative Stefanik. We are deeply troubled by what's happening at Harvard because it's essentially the equivalent of a blacklist. If you join a particular group that Harvard doesn't want you to join, certain academic opportunities will be cut off to you. You will not be eligible to receive recommendations for Rhodes scholarships, the ability to be captains of sports teams.
Head of a student organization, yes.
So it's deeply troubling. At a public institution, there'd be no doubt that it would be unconstitutional. No doubt whatsoever. At private institutions, courts have usually viewed a distinction and said that private institutions that say up front that they value academic freedom and free speech have to abide by those promises. If they collect tuition dollars, they can't then backtrack on that. I think that same line makes sense with the freedom of association because it's so intimately linked. The ability to organize around collective ideas and to express your views on them is so important collectively. So there are very few areas where we would say having a financial tie from Congress would be helpful. This is one where we would make it very narrow and carefully tailor it so it wasn't all federal funds, et cetera. We don't want to encourage too much, overreaction, but they should have an ability for Congress to say, schools can't tell people, what organizations they can join.
Just to dive a little bit more specifically into this, is that the amount of federal funds, Title IV versus, federal research dollars, which institutions like Harvard get a huge amount of federal research dollars. How do we get to the specifics of this from the policymaking perspective?
So I think you want to use the lightest effective touch you think you can use to bring schools around to stop infringing on students' associative rights. The concern that we have is always, the overreaction. Does every student need to lose their Pell Grants if there's a policy that we think, is bad here? I would want to avoid that kind of outcome.
Yes, and I'm a big proponent of Pell Grants. I'm proud that I led the effort to make Pell Grants year-round. I do think it's important. We've talked about some of these examples where administration is not doing the best job, and Mr. Wood, thank you for your testimony on that. I do want to praise higher ed institutions that I think are getting it right, and the University of Chicago for their incoming class of 2020, I want to quote, and I have enough time. Once here, you will discover that one of the University of Chicago's defining characteristics is our commitment to freedom of inquiry and expression. This is captured in the university's faculty report on freedom of expression. Members of our community are encouraged to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn without fear of censorship. Civility and mutual respect are vital to all of us, and freedom of expression does not mean the freedom to harass or threaten others. You will find that we expect members of our community to be engaged in rigorous debate, discussion, and even disagreement. At times, this may challenge you and even cause discomfort. I think this is an exceptional example of administrative leadership coming from a higher ed institution, and I think more schools should strive for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Stefanik. Ms. Wilson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Fox, for holding today's hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. I'm very concerned with protecting the right to free speech, but I'm equally as concerned with protecting the rights of minority students seeking access to a higher education. This year alone, we have seen a slew of vicious attacks on minority students across this country. At American University, bananas were hung from nooses after a member of my sorority, an African-American woman, was elected president of the University Student Government Association. At the University of Maryland, Richard Collins III, an African-American who was set to graduate to be commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army, was stabbed to death by another student that was indoctrinated by white supremacists. A fraternity at Baylor University sponsored a fraternity at Baylor University sponsored a Mexican-themed party complete with a border wall and offensive Mexican stereotypes. And the list of such incidents goes on and on. So yes, I'm concerned with what is taking place on our campuses. Students are being singled out and harassed on the basis of their race, sexuality, religion, and physical ability. I fear that the value of free speech is being used as political cover in a manner inconsistent with the First Amendment to harass and assault our most vulnerable student groups. We must not make the mistake of creating a false equivalency between the responsibility we have to protect the rhetoric of white supremacists and defending our female, LGBTQ, Black, brown, Muslim, and disabled students from hateful attacks. The doctrine of both sides threaten to further legitimize extreme and violent behavior and compromise the clearly embattled rights of minority students. With these concerns in mind, I would like to ask a question of Ms. Nossel. When is the First Amendment most often invoked on college campuses, and why is this alarming? And does data support these claims?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're alluding to is that particularly over the last 18 months or so, we've had a series of speakers who've gone from campus to campus with a very provocative, and at times intimidating message, threatening to, for example, out students who may be undocumented or goading students based on their sexual orientation or their race. And the First Amendment comes up very prominently as they assert their rights to come to campus, those who've invited them, defend against time, place, and manner restrictions that might limit when and where they can speak. And I think the real risk of this is that students come to know the First Amendment as something that's relevant only to protect speech that offends and intimidates them. And I think that's very dangerous. We've talked a lot about the fact that the students lack grounding in the First Amendment, they don't understand it, they're not educated in those principles from a young age, and when they encounter them only in this way, you can understand why some students, we had a student at one of our convenings say, the First Amendment wasn't written for me. And I was shocked as a law graduate to hear her say that, but what she meant was, at the time it was written, her forebears would not have been at the table. They were not considered 3/4 of a person, and that the only way she hears it invoked is to protect this speech that is targeting her. So I think if colleges are not cognizant of those concerns and considerations and how we build a culture across gender, race, identity of respect for the First Amendment, how students can utilize the First Amendment to assert their own rights, I think we run a real risk of raising a generation that is alienated from this core principle. And I think that's one of the real dangers of politicizing this issue.
And how to do today's demographics of student population affect education and how college campuses are operating?
Yeah, I think many of these campuses, originated to serve a student body that was quite homogenous, elite, male, white, and those demographics have changed dramatically. Students are coming from radically different backgrounds, and yet many of the practices and norms on those campuses haven't adapted. So the way things are talked about in the classroom, the way the courses that are offered, and I do think the university needs to continue to adapt. A lot has been done, and many universities have been at the forefront of this in terms of what it takes to make a student who is from a poor background feel just as comfortable and able to participate in campus life than someone who comes from an elite suburban high school. But there's more work to be done to make the campus fully inclusive, and that work needs to progress if we are to effectively defend the First Amendment and free speech on campus.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. Mr. Paulson, I want to just say I love in your opening statement, your quote that the land of the free has become the home of the easily offended. We've taught our children over the years to be open to a lot of different ideas and to put yourself into situations where others think differently than you. Get into those environments, and so I just I appreciate that you made that observation. Earlier this year, the Georgia State Legislature passed a bill that protects campuses, protects free speech at campuses, and commend what the Georgia Legislature and Governor Deal have done. Are you familiar at all with that legislation?
I'm not familiar with the Georgia legislation. I'm familiar with, I think, about 25 states who have passed similar legislation.
Okay. You're shaking your head yes on that?
I am familiar with the legislation. It's complicated because at FIRE we very strongly support legislation that helps eliminate free speech zones, finds this right line on harassment, so schools have the tools they need without overstepping on the First Amendment at the same time. The Georgia legislation made some mistakes in it that don't quite match exactly what the case law has said, and we're already working with its sponsor to make those changes for the upcoming legislative session. But I think it's a good reminder that it can be done, but it needs to be done very carefully.
Thank you for that observation. And one other thing I'd like to do is I'd like to say that we appreciate Chairwoman Fox's efforts in the Prosper bill to make sure that free speech protections are in that. This to me is, again, I go back to my role as a parent. We want our kids in situations where they have to learn to think for themselves, where they have to think critically, and where they have to recognize what bad behavior is, and they've got to call it out for that. I want if my children are in an academic setting or really any setting, and they see something that's offensive, I want them to experience that so that they can be as repulsed by it as anybody. But the only way to do that is to have an open dialogue where these different views can be expressed. So with that, I yield back. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Cohen, in your written testimony, you mentioned that Penn State's sexual harassment policy is overly broad, defined as any verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that is unwanted, inappropriate, or unconsented to. Is it possible that a policy that doesn't conform to case law and may in fact be broader than current law bring about a positive change in social and eventually legal standards?
I don't think that an unconstitutional policy is helpful. I do think that there is good reason for critics who felt like schools were not properly protecting students from sexual harassment. I think that there are well cataloged examples and way too much of sweeping allegations of sexual harassment under the rug. So I think there is some positive that comes out of urging schools to take the issue more seriously, but I don't think it is positive when schools have subjective criteria that has been found unconstitutional repeatedly in circuits over and over and over again.
Thank you. Mr. Paulson, in your written testimony, you stated that you don't believe that there's an epidemic of suppression or intolerance in the nation's universities, and that students have greater concerns about college. Indeed, I believe they do. I was a professor for 40 years, but can you please elaborate on these greater concerns?
Well, I think I'm intrigued by the whole conversation where we center on the threat to free expression on a college campus. And it's almost as though we think that this problem or dilemma stops at the borders of the campus. But a recent study by the Knight Foundation and the Museum Institute found that 51% of Americans, that's college students, 51% of Americans would support the disinvitation of a speaker who might provoke protests. That's a majority of Americans, not college students. So to the extent we have this intolerance and disrespect for the First Amendment, it's not about college campuses, it's about America. And so I feel like it is wonderful to be vigilant about college campuses, but the truth is, as a society, we need to understand that freedom of speech also means at least a theoretical obligation to listen to the other guy, and we get stronger at that. So I don't believe there's an epidemic on college campuses. I think there's a challenge America faces, and it manifests itself on college campuses. But if I were to suggest paths to address this, it would not begin on the college campus, nor would it end there.
Okay, so the statistics you gave, you said 51% of Americans. So what percentage do you have of the university, or did you have any research there?
Well, we have approximately, we've actually had that number out today. It's about half of students believe you shouldn't be allowed to say something on a college campus if it might offend someone of another race. First Amendment Center surveys have found 65% of Americans, 2 out of 3 believe that. So whatever is happening out there is happening everywhere. It's happening on college campuses, it's happening on the internet, it's happening in neighborhood bars. We are afraid to speak candidly in too many occasions, or people are telling us we can't speak candidly in too many occasions because they don't want to be offended. Universities, I think, are not the problem. I think they are the solution for the long term.
So the specific ideas that you might have about how we can address this need for education in schools and colleges, keeping in mind that the curriculum is a state and local and individual university issue.
Right.
What would you say to that?
Well, has been discussed here, civics education is critically important early on. And we also need to get to a position where colleges absolutely declare themselves in support of free speech and make a commitment while also protecting against things like threatening speech. 99.9% of all speech is protected by the First Amendment, but the other 1% usually just breaks the law because the threat, intimidation, something like that. If I may, I just wanted to mention one other thing. When I do talk to parents about this issue, I urge them, the way I put it is, have what for dinner and why for dessert. When you at least spend one day a week with your kids around the dinner table and talk about what happened this week in the world, and then for dessert talk about why people of good faith could disagree about what happened and how it happened. We've got to somehow, both in schools and in the home, remind people that multiple opinions make this country stronger and that we shouldn't fear other ideas.
Great thought. Thank you, sir. I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Grothman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Right. First, just I have a comment for Mr. Paulson. You said Congress does many wonderful things. Afterwards, I'm going to talk to you and find out what those wonderful things are, because I ran offhand. But in general, I think one of the problems we have on campuses is if our campuses don't look like America, we create an atmosphere that encourages stifling of speech, encourages an environment of hatred and small-mindedness. Now, my staff found for me an article that recently appeared in the National Association of Scholars, in which an academic named Mitchell Langbert did some research on campuses, and he looked at quite a few different colleges. He found 78% of the academic departments in his survey had no people who you would identify as Republican. As you went through different types of departments, he found, say, in sociology, 44 Democrats for every 1 Republican. He couldn't find any Republican at all in communications or anthropology. If in another areas such as race, say whatever, I don't know what percentage of America today is African American, maybe 13, 14%. If we had a university campus that had 1% or 0.5% or 0.1% African American, we'd wonder if something was wrong. America today is always around 50% Republican, 50% Democrat, maybe 45, 55, whatever. But you would expect, if there wasn't a lot of real conservative Christian hatred out there, you would expect normally, therefore, the faculty to reflect America, be 50-50, 45-55, something like that. But it's not. Can any of you explain to me why things are so out of whack and what we can do to turn things around? Again, I think if there was such obvious prejudice on a racial bent, on a religious bent, I think probably everybody here would be demanding the federal government crack down on that university. And if we find a university in which there are, I mean, in some campuses, Wisconsin, we don't have to register Republican, Democrat, but if you found a campus in which 90%, 95% of the faculty were one party or the other, where it was obvious in an environment of hatred towards one ideology or one religion, should the federal government be involved in that if that is going on at campuses?
I think there's no question that the universities and society at large really benefits from a truly diverse faculty and student base, whether it's demographically and also with viewpoints. And I don't think that has to be intention. There are some folks who really only think about it demographically. There are other folks who only think about it in terms of viewpoints, but both are really crucially important in our view. What I wouldn't do is do quota.
You consider it a problem?
I certainly consider it a problem. I wouldn't.
Is it a severe problem if we send people out to learn about the world, English literature, communication arts, and they're obviously living in an environment in which one ideology or religion or whatever is so overwhelmingly favored over the other? Is that a problem?
It has tremendous implications when students are only learning from people from certain perspectives. But I would say that one of the things that needs to be done is to look closely at the question of a case called Garcetti versus Sabalos, which talks about when public employees have free speech rights or when they can be curtailed by their employers.
Would you be saying the same thing if, for example, it was apparent they were discriminating against people of a different religion or different race? Would you be equivocating here and trying to rationalize it?
No, I'm not trying to equivocate. I'm trying to talk about what I think will be effective solutions here, which is making sure that the robust free speech rights of all faculty are protected, because we sometimes...
No, we're not talking about free speech of faculty. We're saying, should students who go to a university get a diverse faculty? Should people of different backgrounds be recruited? I mean, I talk to people, as I'm sure other conservative politicians too. People say, I'd like to be a professor, but the dread in their voice at having to pretend to be who they are not for years as they work towards tenure.
Absolutely.
Is that a problem? I'm not saying what...
Absolutely, they should be recruited.
Is it a huge problem that the federal government should address?
Absolutely, they should be recruited, but the solutions need to be better than the problem itself. So we get concerned when there's something like a quota system, as was proposed in Iowa, which is probably not the ideal way to handle it. But I think a lot of attention to it is important. There are ways that Congress can actually get involved that would help.
Mr. Cohen, I'd encourage you to send that to Mr. Grothman in writing,
Will do.
any of the members of the panel, okay? Mr. Smucker, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Mr. Cohen, I want to just follow up. You talked about some of the pending cases that we should be watching and following as this develops. What are some of those key cases that you think we should be following?
So the case that I was talking about first was the one at Gwinnett College that's going to deal with that standing question. I think that that's a really crucial case for us to watch along the pipeline. So I think that's the one I'm watching the most closely. I'd actually like to consult and get back to you in writing later on so I can give you a more thorough analysis of what cases in the entire universe are out there that really merit your watchful eye.
That'd be great. And then, we've taken a look at some of the results from the Brookings Institution survey on First Amendment views that are held by undergraduate students, and it's pretty clear from the results that many of the students have a different perspective of the scope of the First Amendment versus what case law may support. So, I think someone asked a question earlier, education of students, what in regards to First Amendments. What I want to hear from you was, in your opinion, what projects have been most successful? What is working in terms of instilling in students, and really maybe even broader, instilling in the American people a better understanding of our First Amendment freedoms?
Well, I agree with Mr. Paulson that starting earlier than college is particularly helpful. At the college level, we've seen a number of schools adopt the Chicago Statement of Principles on campus free speech that anchor the administration to valuing the First Amendment even when it's messy and difficult. And I think having conversations about that in orientations are helpful. I would also add it's helpful to address other civil rights issues so students don't perceive the First Amendment as being the only thing that is of value at that time, but it certainly has to be part of that early curriculum to instill respect for these concepts.
Thank you. And then, Mr. Wood, I've heard from constituents the concern that the actions that Harvard is taking could end up having an impact in a broader way, an impact on organizations in public institutions. Whether you agree or not, it certainly does create an environment of ambiguity. Do you think that the free speech and freedom of association challenges we are seeing at private institutions could not only trickle into public colleges and universities, but also into settings outside of academia?
Unfortunately, sir, I do think that's possible. I hope that necessary.
Have you seen that happen with other First Amendment challenges?
I haven't seen so much issues with free association at Williams, but I have seen significant issues with respect to a constraint in terms of what issues, what topics, what viewpoints are discussed and aired.
Thank you. Then just one, I'll let anyone answer this question. Is there a need at time for campuses to balance protecting First Amendment freedoms with their duty for providing campus safety? Is that a factor that universities are taking into consideration?
I mean, I wouldn't posit it as a balancing per se. I think they need to do both. They need to ensure a physically safe campus, and they need to ensure an open campus, and that may require spending money on ensuring the security of high-profile events. But it is the very rare, I think, extreme case where those two imperatives can't be reconciled through careful planning and attention and resources.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smucker. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the panel. This is something I guess our founders debated when we set out to give everyone in this country a voice, and which I think is important. But at the same time, I mean, Mr. Wood, I admire your courage. And but at the same time, I mean, here here in Washington, I mean, we have to be careful which restaurant we go to eat in. I mean, I don't understand it. I don't understand how we got this way, other than we know that division is, a house divided cannot stand. That we have to find a way to come together to reason with one another in a way that's civil and debate. And the way you win public opinion is through trust and obviously some type of a moral compass. What you tried to accomplish, where are you with your current situation, and what would you like to see us do to, I mean, obviously, I don't, we have obviously the First Amendment, but what would you like to see the Education and Workforce Committee do to help you in your current situation?
Thank you for the question, Representative Allen. I think I concur with what Mr. Cohn said. I think that with respect to legislation, it should certainly be careful measures should be taken. I think that the state of Tennessee passed legislation last summer that addressed specifically a heckler's veto, and that's an issue that I've experienced on my own campus, and it's an issue that I've seen taking place on a number of college campuses. And so I think measures that might address students who don't want to protest as a way of just exercising dissent, but want to prevent a speaker from actually from presenting their viewpoint, I think that can be addressed.
Yeah, good, great, okay. Well, I'm hopeful that we can come to an agreement on something that might work for everyone. As I've said many times, it's a shame we have to legislate these things. We would hope that folks would be able to come to a common understanding. But again, we're in a little different situation in this day and time, and I hope that we can do better. Mr. Cohn, you got any thoughts on as far as what the committee can do to help with your?
Yeah, I think that the two best steps the committee can take with respect to free speech would be to target free speech zones where there's political consensus that they're wrong and unlawful, and courts have spoken with near unanimity, creating a pretty careful and well thought out test, making sure schools are using it, and also setting that balance right with anti-harassment measures to make sure that schools are responding to known instances of harassment as they're both legally and morally required to do so, while refocusing their attention on the tests that the courts have used to make sure that balance is done without stepping on the toes of the First Amendment, because as I think we have all been unanimous about, both goals are important and crucial to accomplish. So those are the two things that I would do on free speech. I would also I agree with Representative Stefanik that addressing the freedom of association question she raised is another thing that can be done legislatively without introducing additional complications.
Mr. Paulson, you got anything to add to that as far as what we can do?
Well, as I've noted, with all due respect, I don't think legislation is the key here. I don't think pressure on universities is the key here. I would love to see congressional support for early civic education and an awareness, a society-wide awareness that the free exchange of ideas is what makes us uniquely American. We've done a great job of teaching science and math, but science and math are universal. But teaching about freedom of speech and freedom of faith, unfortunately, that's not universal. And we can't treat that as an add-on. And I think if we could address these issues early on, we will have a new generation that gets the purpose of free speech, and we're not going to have the dramatic confrontations, and legislatures will not have to step in.
Well, it's mind, body, and heart.
Yes, sir.
And we have a heart problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Ms. Wilson, I want to thank our witnesses again for taking the time to testify before the committee, and I'll recognize Ms. Wilson for her closing remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to start by addressing Mr. Paulson's comments in response to Dr. Adams. I agree, the lack of public understanding of and appreciation for First Amendment rights is in fact a problem not limited to college campuses. It is a challenge faced by the entire nation. The exchange reminded me of the current administration's lack of appreciation for First Amendment rights of Black professional athletes who kneel in peaceful protest during the national anthem. The White House intervention in these peaceful protests is a disgrace, and that is unfortunate. Protecting free speech rights under the First Amendment and protecting the rights of students to a safe and inclusive learning environment under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 both require vigilance by America's universities. Today's testimony has confirmed that doing so requires striking a careful and necessary balance to accomplish this goal, but it can be done. The Office of Civil Rights language that Ranking Member Scott referred to in his opening statement illustrates how this can be done in a manner that respects, honors, and upholds both these principles. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. It's been a lively conversation that reminds us of the importance of providing students with an opportunity to engage in civil discourse over differing viewpoints, while ensuring an equal and safe learning environment for all students, especially when more students from diverse backgrounds are attending college than ever before. And that's exactly what I do. I send boys of color to college by the hundreds. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. And again, I want to thank our witnesses for presenting some extremely valuable testimony today. Students in America face First Amendment restrictions, not only on college campuses, but also in high school and elementary school, as we've seen many, many times. And these instances happen too frequently. Our founding documents affirm certain unalienable rights possessed by all individuals, and those rights should not disappear when a student enters onto an educational campus. Those liberties are the envy of people all over the world, and we as a society must do what we can to protect and uphold those freedoms. I am particularly thankful to some of the emphases you all gave today to the issues like free speech zone goes from coast to coast. Our First Amendment rights go from coast to coast, all of them. I appreciate the emphasis you've given to helping students from the age of 5 or when they enter an educational institution in this country understand what their rights are and also their responsibilities. I have to tell you, anytime I'm invited to speak to a group of students, I take my copy of I didn't bring it this morning, my bag, copy of the Pocket Constitution, and show them what is the basis of our laws. That's what I want them to understand. And I ask them in elementary school to read it once a year. So it's really important that they learn it from early on. And I do think the fact that it's not taught as it used to be taught in educational institutions is one of the reasons we're having so many problems. And I agree with my colleagues that more of it needs to be done in the home, and there needs to be more discourse in the home with students. Although this hearing is drawing to a close, it's clear the conversation is far from over. This committee has been clear on this issue. We believe all educational institutions should adopt policies that uphold First Amendment rights of every individual. I look forward to working with students, faculty, institutional leaders, national associations, states, and other members of Congress to ensure this great experiment thrives for many generations to come. There being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.